Next up, low G plus C gram-positive bacteria. First, let's talk about what we mean by G plus C gram-positive bacteria. You should remember the gram-positive bacteria have a very thick peptidoglycan layer in their cell walls. Then the G plus C relates to guanine and cytosine. So this talks about the percentage of these pairs of nucleotides that these bacteria have in their genomes. Back before we could do nucleotide sequencing, we had to go with these percentages. Now, as it turns out, gram-positive bacteria that have low G plus C ratios are very closely related, and gram-positive bacteria that have high G plus C ratios are also related. Unfortunately, this doesn't work for gram-negative bacteria. Now, the order that I'm going to cover these in are, I'm going to cover the rods first, the bacillus, the clostridia, the listeria, and the lactobacillus. Then I'm going to cover the cocci, streptococcus and enterococcus and staphylococcus. Then I'm going to finish up with the mycoplasmas, which do not have a cell wall. Now, I'm covering it in this order because this is how I remember them. This is how I keep them separate. But I want you to know that how they're related is the clostridia are more closely related to the mycoplasmas, and the bacillus, listeria, lactobacillus, and the cocci are the next group. But logically, that doesn't make any sense to me. But do remember that's how they're actually related. So first up, the genus Bacillus. Bacillus is also a shape. This genus was named after its shape. All of the genus Bacillus are large rods. So try not to get that confused. Bacillus are all gram-positive. They're rods, as evidenced by their names, and they're obligate aerobes. At least they tend to be obligate aerobes. And they form endospores. Remember back to the section on endospores and our discussion about disinfectants about endospores? These guys form endospores. They're very common soil bacteria. Now, we've got some good guys and we've got some bad guys. Let's talk about one of the good guys first, at least from our perspective. Bacillus thuringiensis produces a toxin that we abbreviate the Bt toxin after the B and the T in the name. This toxin kills caterpillars. Once these larval insects eat the Bt toxin, their stomachs change the shape of the toxin, and it basically becomes little shards of glass, and it cuts them up from the inside. It's non-toxic for mammals. We have an acidic stomach, which does not cause the Bt toxin to form into molecular shards of glass. We like to use Bacillus thuringiensis in organic farming because you can we used to be that we would take the bacillus and the toxin and spray it on crops, and it would kill the caterpillars, and it's non-toxic. You don't have to wear special equipment to keep, from breathing in the insecticide that would kill you, and it works very effectively. Well, they took it a step further. They took the gene for Bt toxin out of the bacillus, and they incorporated it into the plants. And now we have Bt plants that produce the Bt toxin in their leaves. Remember back when I said that we had a shared genetic code? You could take a gene from a bacterium and put it into a plant? Well, that's what we did, and very clever. Unfortunately, we now have caterpillars that have developed resistance to the Bt toxin. It's not just bacteria that develop resistance. Oh well, we'll come up with something else. Now, for the bad guys, for the bacillus. Bacillus anthracis causes anthrax. You probably are familiar with anthrax. In 2001, a couple of months after the horrible events of 9/11, various public officials started getting envelopes full of white powder. Quite a few of them became sick. Some developed black lesions, usually on their hands. Some developed a very odd type of pneumonia that didn't respond to antibiotics. And when they took cultures, most pneumonia is caused by cocci, either streptococci or staphylococci. Some of them are caused by mycoplasmas. We'll get to that later. But they kept finding these big gram-positive rods. Well, as it turns out, somebody was mailing weaponized Bacillus anthracis endospores through the mail. The anthrax pneumonia is very hard to treat. The cutaneous anthrax, about 50% of the people who became ill had the cutaneous anthrax. That's usually not fatal, but you still got to treat it. And we spent an awful lot of time figuring out how to not only cure the folks who had the anthrax, but also how to clean up the offices where the anthrax spores had been spread, the postal offices, because envelopes are not airtight. They're not intended to be airtight. So there were spores all over the place, and yeah, that was a wonderful job. Yes, I'm being sarcastic. Now, anytime anybody gets an envelope full of cornstarch, they go through and check for B. anthracis endospores. Before you think that it's always been this way, you notice I called it weaponized. We have modified it from its original so that it's more pathogenic in humans. The original Bacillus anthracis was not terribly pathogenic to humans. It's an animal disease. And it used to be that if you got anthrax into your herd, you were up a creek. It would kill most of your herd, and you couldn't eat the animals, because anthrax would turn the internal organs of your cows, sheep, goats, into black goo, and you really can't eat that. So it meant that you would starve, or you would lose your farm, or other terrible things. So for Bacillus, we have the good guys, and we've got the bad guys. It just depends upon which species it is. On to Clostridia. Now I do Clostridia next because it is a large gram-positive rod, has a low G+C content, and it forms endospores, as you can see from this lovely micrograph. See those big terminal endospores? Now, to distinguish it from the genus Bacillus, Clostridia are obligate anaerobes. Remember, Bacillus is an obligate aerobe. So pretty much Bacilli and Clostridia are the same, it's just their oxygen requirements. And I cannot think of a single good example of Clostridia. The first one is Clostridium botulinum. You probably already figured out from the name that it causes botulism. Usually it's a food poisoning related type of thing where, remember, they're anaerobes, so you do improper canning, you don't kill all the endospores, it's an airless environment inside the can. The C. botulinum says, oh, this is perfect. They sporulate from their endospores, form vegetative cells, and produce the botulism toxin, which is a neurotoxin. And it causes flaccidity. In other words, it causes your muscles to relax to the point where your diaphragm relaxes and you stop breathing. Now, I somewhat lied when I said I couldn't think of anything good about Clostridia. This horrible toxin, botulism toxin, we've been able to use for therapeutic procedures when it's diluted. So you've probably heard of Botox injections. That's the botulism toxin. You just take a little bit amount, inject it into the muscles of the face, causes them to relax, and the wrinkles go away. Well, we use Botox for more than just wrinkles. There's a condition in which the muscles of the that control the vocal cords seize up, and it makes it so people can't speak. We go in, inject those muscles with Botox, diluted botulism toxin, cause those muscles to relax, and the patient is able to speak. Several other situations in which we have muscles that won't relax, we go in, give an injection of Botox, and they relax, and it relieves the symptoms of the patient. So there is one good thing about Clostridia, but it's because we as humans are very clever and inventive. Now, the exact opposite is Clostridium tetani, which causes tetanus. The tetanus toxin causes the exact opposite of the botulism toxin. It causes your muscles to seize up and not relax. It's also known as lockjaw because the muscles of the jaw clench and you can't open your mouth and you're on a liquid diet, and eventually used to be that you died. We have wonderful vaccines for this now. Now there's two others. C. perfringens causes gas gangrene. I'm not going to go over that one as much. But C. difficile has become a real problem recently. Usually anywhere where you have extended care, be it an ICU, nursing homes, rehabilitation centers where people are really sick or injured. Usually we have to give folks severe antibiotics when they're in these facilities because they're sick with something else, they're injured, and their immune systems are down. Well, what happens is you get rid of everything but the C. difficile, and the C. difficile takes over your intestines. And it causes severe, persistent diarrhea, and you don't need that on top of everything else. Also, because the patients are producing high numbers of endospores, it gets passed to the staff and to other patients. And because the endospores, it's hard to treat it with antibiotics. So that's Clostridia. Now on to the gram-positive, non-spore-forming rods. The first one is Listeria. Listeria, can't think of a good example of Listeria. Listeria is found in some forms of food poisoning. It can grow at refrigeration temperatures, not very fast, but it can grow. It's resistant to salt, and because of these two things, we have a tendency to see Listeria in milk products, and we have a tendency to see them in cold cuts, prepared meat. Now, the main species that we see is Listeria monocytogenes. This causes relatively mild gastrointestinal distress in adults and older children, but if a woman who is pregnant becomes infected, the Listeria monocytogenes can cross the placenta and infects the fetus, and this can result in either miscarriages or stillbirths. So it's a big problem for pregnant women. And this is one of the reasons why we pasteurize milk. The pasteurization process will kill the Listeria, and then you don't have to worry about it. In milk, anyway. You may have remembered a couple of years ago, we had a Listeria outbreak in cantaloupe. The problem being we eat cantaloupe raw, and it's hard to wash and disinfect that convoluted rind. So you cut through the rind where the Listeria is, gets into the center, you keep it in the refrigerator, and it continues to grow. And then people who eat it get sick. And even though I said that Listeria is relatively mild, that doesn't mean that you can't die from it. It's just that most people don't. Now on to our other gram-positive rod that does not form endospores, and this would be the Lactobacillus. Now, in exact opposition to Listeria, which causes food poisoning, Lactobacillus is used in the food industry, in food microbiology, in quite a few of our dairy products. They are used to make yogurt and cheeses and just about anything that you think of that is a fermented dairy product. So whereas Listeria makes you sick, Lactobacillus takes dairy products and turns them into luscious goodness. Now, another thing to keep in mind with Lactobacillus is this is an example of an aerotolerant anaerobe. They do not have an electron transport chain. They are limited to fermentation. That's why they produce lactic acid, which curdles milk proteins, which leads to cheeses and yogurts, etc. Even though they do not have an electron transport chain, they do have the enzymes to deal with the poisonous byproducts of oxygen. So they're not using oxygen, but they're not killed by it. If they were obligate anaerobes, we probably wouldn't have developed them for use in the dairy industry because keeping anaerobic conditions is just really hard.